In our last episode, we used the memento mortem to discover that the captain's wife Abigail was killed when she was struck by rigging during an attack upon the ship by the Kraken. We then went back in time step by step to watch the crew try to battle the Kraken. They tried to use black powder, which ended up killing one of their members, and we unlocked access to the gun deck, where we found men crushed by cannons and ripped to shreds by the tentacles of the Kraken. After exploring the final flashback, we can at last explore the gun deck as it is today. We see the path of a cannonball as it ripped through the very hull of the ship. And now we can explore the rooms on the gun deck. Opening the first door, we see an exit path for the cannonball that killed the bald midshipman. His body was likely sent outside. In the next room, we find a small dinghy hanging above the bed and a unique whistle hanging from a rack. This is a bosun's whistle. And taking a look at our ship plan, sure enough, we see that this is the bosun's cabin. The one right next to it that the cannonball cut through is the cabin for the bosun mate. Taking a look at our glossary, we learn that a bosun is a foreman in charge of general crew operations and the equipment required to sail the ship. We'll have to bear all of this in mind while searching for clues to try to identify these people. Heading out of the bosun's cabin and crossing the hall, we can explore the door directly in front of us. Inside, we find 3 bunks and some clothing hanging above a wash basin. These clothing items are unique. Perhaps they are uniforms for the people who lived in this cabin. And if so, maybe we can keep an eye out for uniforms like these to help us make identifications. Taking a look at our ship plan, we see that this room was the room for the stewards. So if we find people wearing these uniforms, we'll know that they're the stewards. Heading out, we can move to the next room and we see puddles of blood and a knife on the ground right outside the door. Opening the door, we find our next body. There's a small dinghy hanging in here, a hanging bag, and a couple of beds. Taking a look at our map of the ship, we see that this was the cabin for the midshipman. That makes it likely that the body lying here is the body of a midshipman. But to find out what happened to this poor soul, we must activate our memento mortem.
Oh no, you're cut.
Don't leave me.
Bear up, son. I'll stay with you.
Tell Pete's mother I tried my best.
Aye.
To pull him back, to save him.
You tell her yourself. Brennan! Bring the surgeon's kit!
We see a man bleeding his life out onto the floor of his cabin, and we recognize him. He's one of the men wearing the unique neckerchief that we saw battling the Kraken above deck in our last episode. Next to him is presumably the man who was trying to comfort him. We've already identified him, First Mate Huskett, but now we know that he was Scottish. Heading out of the cabin, we see that the trail of blood leads towards the stern of the ship. A man is coming down from the deck, and we recognize him as one of the captain's assailants from episode 1. And continuing towards the stern, we see a bloody scene. The other man who tried to assail the captain is standing over bodies with a bludgeon in his hand. On the ground, we find the corpse of another man wearing an officer's hat, and next to him is the man with the beard wearing the unique hat who was bringing weapons above deck in a previous memory. The trail of blood leads to an opening at the back of the ship, but here the memory goes dark. Chapter 9, Escape. Part 6, In the Midshipman Cabin. The victim's face is blurry. We can't identify him yet, but we can deduce his cause of death. There was a knife on the ground outside his cabin. It is likely what killed him, but we don't know who attacked him. So for now, we'll say that he was knifed by an unknown attacker. Checking the transcript, we find a number of clues. We recognize the man who was comforting this guy as First Mate Huskett, the brother of Abigail. But all that was on this victim's mind was regret over being unable to save Pete. He tried to pull him back to save him. Now, we recall in the last episode, when we last saw this guy, he had a rope in his hand and he was trying to save another midshipman wearing a similar neckerchief who ended up getting blasted by a barrel of black powder. So, if the name of the man this guy was trying to save was Pete, and if we see him trying to save this guy in a previous memory, then we can deduce that the man who died in our last episode, blasted by an explosion, was named Pete. This makes things easier. We now go through the manifest to find anyone named Pete. And there's only one. Peter Milroy, number 33. And sure enough, he's a midshipman. The man who died in this memory died in the midshipman cabin, which likely also makes him a midshipman, which would explain why he was friends with Pete and tried to save him. They probably bunked together and knew each other really well. There were only 4 midshipmen on this ship, so the man who died in this cabin is either Thomas Lanke, Charles Hirschstick, or unknown. We sadly don't have enough information to deduce his identity yet, but they all wear distinctive neckerchiefs, which will help us out later. But at least now, we can identify Peter. Our next clue also comes from the transcript. Our Scottish first mate Hoskett shouted out to a man named Brennan. Brennan, bring the surgeon's kit. But who was he talking to? While inspecting this scene again, we find only one person who seems to be responding to the first mate's call. And that's the man with the cudgel in his hand, with his hand to his ear, almost as if he's trying to listen to someone who might be calling his name. He's looking towards the first mate. This man is likely Brennan, and sure enough, his face is now unblurred. We have enough information to identify him. So, going on our hunch, we'll conclude that this man, knifed by the captain in our very first episode, is none other than Seaman Henry Brennan. Well done. 3 more fates correct. And 3 more fates correct. It's so much easier when they give us names. And we got 2 in this memory, a rare luxury. When done, we see that our memento mortem is shaking. We can activate it to find the next corpse. And it's one of the bodies lying on the ground beneath Brennan. Back to the present, we can activate the ghostly trail. And it deposits the body right where we saw it in the memory. Now to explore it.
What's all this, you damn fool?
Brennan knocks this guy in the side of the head, delivering a killing blow. We see that the man he killed is wearing a hat, and he had a gun in his hand. He was standing over this other body, which likely makes him this person's murderer. We see that trail of blood leading from this other murder victim heading into the rear room, but it's too dim, we can't explore it. We see First Mate Hoskett coming down the stairs on his way to comfort our dying midshipman, and we find the midshipman clawing his way back to his cabin, knife in his back, which confirms our assumption that he was killed with a knife. Part 5 on the aft gun deck. As usual, we don't have enough information to identify this person, but we have all the information we need to record his fate. He was clubbed in the face by a man we know, none other than Seaman Henry Brennan. Taking a look at our Justice at Sea sketch, we see the faces of the people who were in this scene, many of whom we've already identified. But the murder victim here still has a blurry face. Even though his hat tells us that he's likely an officer, we still don't have enough information to identify him concretely. So, out of the book, we can activate the memento mortem. And sure enough, it highlights the other body on the deck. Back at the present.
Captain cannot be trusted.
You have a plan?
Yes. Take ship and sail east. Trade wretched fish and shells for gold. Hey! Who's there?
Mutiny! Mutiny!
Fresh bastard!
No!
Oh, the guy with the officer hat blew this guy's head off with a gun. But even with no bodies on the ground, we still see a trail of blood leading into the back room. But we can't go in to explore just yet. We see more blood heading towards the midshipman cabin, and sure enough, here we see the midshipman with the knife in his back, crawling on the ground to reach his cabin. Looking topside, we see Brennan and Huscott, who likely just heard the gunshot and are about to come down to investigate. But heading up to the poop deck, what is this? We find one of the captain's assailants throwing a body overboard. It's the body of one of the big guys we saw in a previous memory, and there's blood all over the deck. How did he die? Part 4. We don't know who this is, but we know how he died. He was shot with a gun, but we don't know the name of our attacker yet. Inspecting our Justice at Sea sketch, we see all of the faces we've seen so far, but one other, the captain. Heading back out to the memory, we can go up to the poop deck for a better view, and sure enough, there he is. The captain is leaning over a banister, clutching his head. He has a gun in his hand. Something is troubling him. Could he have been the one who killed the large man who is now being thrown overboard? Our memento mortem is shaking. We can release it to find the next body. And it's the man being thrown overboard. Now to learn how he died. Back in the present. The body is in place, and we still see something sparkling out to sea. What could that be? Activating the memory.
Let them go!
Our large guy with a sword in his hand is killed by Emily Jackson. She's on a dinghy escaping out to sea. Next to her is another man, and lying on the deck next to the large man is another man with neatly cropped hair and a neat uniform. Peering over the ship again, we see another person in the dinghy. It's Miss Jane Bird. Turning around, we see the captain leveling his weapon at the man who died in this memory, and behind him is one of the captain's assailants from our first episode. Racing to the gun deck, we see the man with the beard coming after the man who overheard him planning a mutiny. It's our midshipman. Now we know who knifed him in the back. Part 3 on the stern deck. His face is still blurry, but we know how he died. He was shot with a gun by Emily Jackson. And it looks like if Emily hadn't shot him, the captain would have. It was he, after all, who ordered him to let them go, and he refused. Taking a look at the Life at Sea sketch, we find many of the faces of the characters we've seen so far, but there's one we didn't see in the last memory, standing to the right of the officer bludgeoned by Brennan. Heading back to the memory, we see the bearded man with the knife in his hand going after the midshipman, presumably the man who overheard the mutiny. And at this point, we can walk deeper into that back room. Here we find the man with the officer's hat, who shot the man with the beard. The two of them were in this back room talking about the mutiny, but blood goes deeper into this room, and we can't yet. Heading topside, we can try to find this other guy, and we finally find him as yet another passenger in the dinghy. So Emily Jackson, Miss Jane Bird, and two unknown men tried to escape to sea. When ready, we can activate the memento mortem. And sure enough, it highlights the corpse on the poop deck. Back in the present,
Last one. Move quick.
Boy! You'll not take the last one!
Oh, look out!
the big guy with the sword killed the man we saw lying on the deck. He was the one with the neatly cropped hair and the unique uniform. Emily cried out to him, "Paul!" Now we know why she shot the big guy. Peering into the dinghy, we see the same cast of characters, Jane Bird and the two unidentifiable men. Nearby, the captain raises his gun into the air, likely trying to fire a warning shot, and the captain's assailant from our first episode is climbing aboard the ship. First Mate Hoscott and Seaman Brennan are racing towards the scene, and heading down to the gun deck, we find our midshipmen eavesdropping on the conversation going on in this room, where we find 3 people. Part 2. This man's face is unblurred, and that's because we know his name. Emily called it out. Paul, she said, and inspecting the manifest, we find only one Paul. Paul Moss, the first mate's steward. And we know how he was killed. He was killed with a sword, but we don't know the identity of the man who attacked him. So we sadly can't finish this fate just yet. Back in the memory, we see the man in the officer hat leaning forward in his chair, clearly not liking the mutinous conversation going on right now. The man with the beard, likely the one who proposed the mutiny against the captain. And the man who overheard the mutiny, the midshipman, who was knifed in the back by the bearded man. And yet there is already a trail of blood out here. It leads to a body slumped over in this chair. A large-nosed man with a short top hat. And he's missing an arm. Activating the memento mortem. And back at the present. With the body in place, we can explore the memory.
Put me down! Let go!
Easy now. You're in a bad way.
It's the squid. Where is my Frenchman?
The squid's gone. Your mate was torn apart.
That. The beast is dead. How did you kill it?
We didn't. It left with the storm. Captain came up from the hold. Said he chased it off. You should rest.
A curse like that does not live for nothing.
He dies in his chair. He was attended to by the bearded man and the man with the officer's hat, who later shot the bearded man. The trail of blood belonged to the man slumped over in a chair. We see First Mate Hoscott coming out of his cabin, and the midshipman who overheard the mutiny that they were about to talk about coming from below deck. And finally, we see the captain heading topside. Part 1, In the Officer's Mess. We get some major clues from this transcript, which is why this man's portrait is unblurred. There are two major clues here. First, the man who died in the chair said, "Where is my Frenchman?" And then in his next sentence, he says, "Verdammt," and he speaks with a thick German accent. Taking a look at our manifest, we don't find anyone from Germany, but we do find men from Austria, and we know that one of the languages spoken in Austria is German. This man is Alfred Kleistel, the bosun, and he gives us an important clue that we need to remember later on. He says, "Where is my Frenchman?" And then taking a look at the manifest, we learn that the bosun's mate is Charles Minor from France. So he was likely wondering where his mate was. The fact that he speaks German in and of itself isn't enough to identify him, but the fact that he speaks German and is concerned about a Frenchman makes it unlikely that this person would be anyone else but the bosun. The bosun expresses concern for his Frenchman, and he's informed that his Frenchman was killed by the beast. This not only tells us the bosun's mate's fate, but it also gives us a likely explanation for the bosun's fate. Indeed, we know this man was attacked by the beast. The large amount of blood leading to this chair came from the fact that he's missing an arm. We last saw this guy in our last video, The Doom Part 1. And in that video, the Kraken had a tentacle wrapped around this arm. And next to him is that bald man with the striped shirt. If the man in the head is the bosun, and this was the moment his arm was ripped off, then the man standing next to him is likely the bosun's mate. We don't have concrete evidence that the man in the striped shirt is indeed the bosun's mate, and so we'll wait on identifying him until we find more evidence later in the game. So, to seal the fate here for Alfred, we'll say that he was torn apart by a beast. When done, we can give this scene a final look before walking out the door to the present. Thus ends Chapter 9, Escape. There were 6 deaths and 4 disappearances. 4 wayward souls disappeared during the events of this chapter. Their fates are cataloged here. They disappeared, escaped out to sea, but where did they go? We need to know where they went before we can record their fates, so we must still gather more evidence. Perhaps this evidence will come as we learn more about the 2 men on the boat with them. So we learned a lot this episode. After the attack of the Kraken, which killed so many people on the ship, the man in the beard and the unknown officer dragged the bosun below deck. After the bosun died, they conspired to mutiny against the captain, but a midshipman overheard them, and so the man in the beard killed the midshipman. But the officer didn't like that, and so he killed the man in the beard. But then Brannon didn't like that, and so he killed the officer with the hat. But we don't know why the Kraken stopped attacking. They didn't kill the Kraken. The man with the beard said that the captain somehow found a way to make the Kraken go away. Perhaps we'll find out in my next episode about the return of the Obra Dinn. I publish many videos each and every week on my channel, so if you don't want to miss it, be sure to subscribe and to click that bell notification button. If you have and you still feel like you're missing out on YouTube notifications, consider following me on Twitter at Oxhorn. I update Twitter manually with every new piece of content that I publish. I have a shirt shop with completely unique designs that you can't find anywhere else. My shirts come in a variety of men's, women's, and children's sizes, and in a wide array of colors. You can find them on other products as well, like smartphone cases, pillows, posters, mugs, stickers, prints, etc. So if interested, you can find a link to my shop in the description below, or you can click here. If you like what I do and you want to support me in a more personal way, consider becoming a patron on Patreon or a member here on YouTube. But more than anything, I'm just so glad you're here watching this video with me today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon with more brand new episodes.